I had two maternal great uncles that came to this area. In 1890, they started a general merchandise store on Main Street in Condon. And in 1898, my father came to Condon to work in that store at the age of 18. My mother was an Irish orphan, came to Condon to live with relatives in 1913, and they married. I grew up in a political family. My father was mayor of Condon in 1913. So every time a Democrat running for statewide office came to Condon, the first place they'd go was our store, whether it was Dick Neuberger or Wayne Morris or Bob Holmes. And I was fascinated by politics. I wanted three things. I wanted to be a lawyer, I wanted to go to Notre Dame, and I wanted to run for and be elected to the legislature. So I accomplished all those things by the time I was 30 years old. I got the job because my family were prominent Democrats. I ran errands and I filed papers, but I had a lot of contact with Senator Neuberger. The most interesting thing about it was the Senate Rackets Committee hearings were going on in those days. I went every day to those hearings. It was fascinating. Jimmy Hoffa was the object of the hearings and all the corruption and in the Teamsters Union. I went to work for Pat Dooley, and he's the one that urged me and wanted me to run for the legislature. Campaigning was fun. I said in later years, when I chose not to run again, that I was really going to miss the campaigning. Well, in those days, you had a lot of territory to cover. And I think I went to every church in Multnomah County, from Sovies Island to Gresham, regardless of the denomination. But the important thing was my then father-in-law and I would get up every morning at 5 o'clock and go down to the industrial section, wherever there were large crews of workers coming on, and we stand at the gate and hand out my literature. The parties were a little bit stronger in those days. When we went to single-member districts, party structure just evaporated, and money became so important. And an example is that when I ran initially, county at large, I spent $6,000. Probably didn't get a contribution that was over $50. When I ran for re-election in 1970, I spent $600. I was an incumbent, and I was running on my record, and that's all it took. I'm very, very fortunate that I had some wonderful mentors. George Van Humison was a tremendous mentor. Pat Dooley was an incredible mentor. He went to the House in '53, and there were 5 Democrats in the House. He was Speaker in '57, the Democrats controlled. And he said, if you run for the legislature, get elected, you'll be a better lawyer. You'll learn that there is more to the Oregon Revised Statutes than just Volume 1 that has a criminal code in it. You'll be a better lawyer. It'll make you a better man, a better husband, better father. But he said, it'll take you about 4 years to get your head out of the clouds and realize that this is not the be-all and the end-all. Well, he was right. Probably the most important legislation that I was involved with was the revision of the criminal code. My object in running for the legislature and what I campaigned on was to revise the criminal code. Well, as a deputy district attorney, I prosecuted over 150 12-person jury trials in a 2-year period, and our criminal code was an absolute patchwork. We go back to the Deedy Code in the 1850s, and it had been amended and amended and amended. You had a larceny crime for stealing something out of a store, and a different larceny crime for theft on a railroad. You had about a dozen theft of livestock crimes, and there was no cohesion to it. and we desperately needed a new criminal code. I introduced the bill in 1967, Senate Bill 212. I drew it with Kathleen Buffet's help. It passed the Senate and it passed the House. That was a very important legislative accomplishment of mine, and something that I worked on for actually the whole 8 years I was in the legislature. We, in 1971, as indeed today, languish in the rural areas as far as economic development is concerned. So as president of the Senate, I created a task force on economic development. We had about 15 members. We had legislators and non-legislators. We had 13 meetings around the state, and we came up with a package of bills that created a Department of Economic Development, put economic development special offices in La Grande and in Central Oregon and in Western Oregon. I can remember going through Bend in 1950 when Brooks Scanlon and the other mills had closed and half of Bend was boarded up. Well, along came Bill Healy, and he developed Bachelor Butte, and look what happened in terms of recreation and expansion, and business followed, and Bend, of course, is a thriving place today, but it wasn't always. After the 1970 election, it developed that there were 15 Democrats and 15 Republicans in the Senate. Now, the Senate had been run by a coalition of conservative Democrats and Republicans since 1957. Senator Potts wouldn't commit to the choice of the Democratic caucus, and the Democratic caucus chose Berkeley Lint. So we convened in January, started the roll call votes, and we went through 2 weeks of roll calls, 2 or 3 times a day, 15 votes for the Republican, 15 for the Democrat. I voted for Lint. Potts wasn't going to change. He wouldn't vote for Berkeley. Some Republicans came to me and said, if you'll vote with Potts, we'll make you the Senate president. And I said, no, I won't. I never told that to anybody. I never solicited any votes. I ultimately decided, well, I'm going to break this impasse. I'm not going to be a professional politician. We've got a limited number of days to have this session. I don't care what the political consequences are. We've got to get to work. The legislature just looks horrible. And so I went back to the Democratic caucus the next day and said, unless we can reach some sort of an agreement, I'm going to vote with Potts. So Potts and I voted for me and the 14 Republicans, and we broke the impasse. And then we got to work. I had deep roots in rural Oregon and had a great relationship with the Eastern and Southern Oregon rural legislators because of my background. And I believe strongly that when you cast your vote, you had to cast that vote for everybody in the state. I mean, Eastern Oregon is very important to Portland, but Portland is very important to Eastern Oregon. You can't operate in a vacuum. I think if you're involved and you can see how hard it is to accomplish anything, but how important it is to do it right, you develop an appreciation which probably makes you a whole lot better at what you're doing, but it also makes you a better citizen, a better person, a more informed and thoughtful voter. So my advice is to get involved early on the grassroots side of it and work your way up. And if you like it and if you have it, you'll succeed, and you can go from there. Yeah, it was great in the United States Senate in 1958, 59, and we had giants there. We have giants there now. We need to give them credit. I don't want to talk about the good old days. The good old days are now. We need to look to the future.